Good morning, trail lovers. Welcome to the revived West Virginia Trails Conference. I'm Amanda Pitzer, the Executive Director of Friends of the Cheat, and I am joined here today in person by Friends of the Cheat's newest employee and your 2021 conference coordinator, Lisa Marafa.
Thanks, Amanda. We are excited to have you all join us virtually for what has shaped up to be a great program featuring trail champions from all across the wild and wonderful state of West Virginia. From the calm, clear waters of the Cheat River Water Trail to the rowdy mountain bike trails at Snowshoe Mountain, West Virginia truly has some of the best trails in the world.
Isn't that the truth? Everyone can find a trail that suits their interests and abilities here in West Virginia. Whether you want a leisurely cruise along the North Bend Rail Trail through one of our unique small towns, or you don't want to see another human being while backpacking through our nation's newest national park, the New River Gorge Park and Preserve, you can find your almost heaven here in West Virginia.
But trails are more than just a place to play. Trails and the greater outdoor economy is big business, and the energy around harnessing this economic power has skyrocketed over the last 2 years. We are fortunate to have leaders and funders in place that understand this power and support our collective efforts to promote West Virginia trails. A big thank you to the Benedum Foundation, whom without we would not be able to have this conference. Thank you to all of our conference sponsors, which you can find under the sponsors tab on the left of the screen. This morning's session is sponsored by Hersick and Webster Designs and the Sustainable Trails Program at the WVU School of Design and Community Development.
Thanks, Lisa. And thanks for all your hard work on the conference.
You're welcome.
We're getting things rolling here. So it is now my honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, the Secretary of Tourism for the great state of West Virginia, Chelsea Ruby. Ms. Ruby was appointed Secretary of the West Virginia Department of Tourism by Governor Justice in March 2021. And this appointment marked an elevation of the tourism office to a cabinet level department, where Chelsea has served as commissioner for 4 years. As secretary, she leads the state's effort to unify and promote the Almost Heaven brand, advance tourism development, and promote the Mountain State to a broader audience, featuring West Virginia as a year-round travel destination to both national and international travelers. Under her leadership, tourism in West Virginia has seen historic success. Prior to the pandemic, West Virginia was seeing great increases in spending and actually outpacing the national rate of growth by 58%. And this year in 2021, the state has quickly rebounded from pandemic losses, and every aspect of outdoor recreation, as we know, has broken records. I remember when we weren't having Cheat Fest last April 2020, we drove River Road and there was a car at every single pull-off along the Cheat River. People really got outside during the pandemic, and we're all happy to be here today to figure out how we can work together to keep that rolling. So please join me in welcoming our honored guest, a fellow West Virginia Wonder Woman and working mom, Miss Chelsea Ruby.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for having me. Amanda, thanks for the very kind introduction. It has been a crazy, crazy year, but I am absolutely thrilled that you all are doing this. Putting on a virtual conference is no easy feat. We've done it. There's a lot of concerns about technical this and that, and will people join? But I think it's really important, more important than ever before, that you all are doing this. So I just want to give my hats off to everyone on here, to Kent, Amanda, everyone with the organization who does such great work day in, day out to enhance outdoor recreation in West Virginia. So with COVID, we've seen a lot of really awful stuff. Every single person in West Virginia has felt the negative impacts of the pandemic. But there is one great thing that came out of COVID, and that is that Americans across the country and around the world fell in love with the great outdoors again. It became a part of their daily lives. I even know in my life, we have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and we get out a good bit. But since the pandemic, every Saturday and Sunday, my little boy's like, where are we going hiking today? I'm like, we don't go hiking every day, but it just became a part of our life when we were home. And so we've really even gotten out more ourselves. So it's been really exciting to see that happen. But I want to back up and tell you that I think that this started before the pandemic. We started seeing our travel and tourism numbers in West Virginia increase about 3 years ago. We started doing this huge push with the Almost Heaven brand. We started advertising more. We were very grateful to the support that the governor and the legislature gave us in tripling the marketing budget. And as you all know, those ads all focus on the scenic beauty of West Virginia, outdoor recreation, the beautiful mountains. And so we've really invested a lot of time and money into promoting that to the outside world. But what happened in COVID was really interesting. We follow very closely every single month cell phone tracking data from around the state, looking at where people are going, how long they're staying, where they're coming from. It's this interesting crisscross across the state. And what we started seeing during the pandemic was that, of course, for a brief period, we started seeing less traffic from out of state, in state. But we saw this huge jump of West Virginians who were suddenly going to new places, to places they'd never been across the state to do new things. You all have all seen it. Every single state, county, national park in our state has seen record-breaking attendance over the last year and a half. There's not a place you can find a kayak or a bicycle or a fishing rod. I mean, there's none of it. People have just really enjoyed their own state. So I know we talk a lot about the increases in out-of-state visitation, and we're very excited about those. But today I wanted to make sure that you all know that one of the most interesting things that we actually saw was the movement in state growing. We've continued to see that to this day. Even looking at our statistics from last month, we are seeing an increase over 2019 in the number of West Virginians who are traveling. So we're excited about it. We think that there is more opportunity than ever before. This industry, the tourism industry and the outdoor recreation industry, is receiving greater attention than we ever have. Not just around the country as these big associations are coming up, but also in state. I regularly meet with local officials around the state, and I've never had a meeting where somebody's not asking me, what can we do to get more trails in my area? It's the hot topic. It's the thing that everyone wants. Even just yesterday here at our tourism industry conference, House Speaker Roger Hanshaw was talking about the huge impact that he's seen with the new Elk River Rail Trail, and how, you know, there are now kayak vendors and cabin companies setting up shop around those. We all know that there's a great opportunity. All of you do, or you wouldn't be spending your time today on another Zoom meeting. And so today, I think I really want to let you all know how much we appreciate your thought leadership and your time in this. If you look around the country, every single state is trying to figure out how can they grow outdoor recreation. We've got a number of states and cities who have provided excellent examples of how to do that. And they are generally led by a group like you all. It's not just the state or the city or the county. It is truly a coalition of all the stakeholders who are looking together to figure out the infrastructure concerns, the maintenance concerns. How do we build systems of trails? How do we deal with overcrowding? How do we deal with trash? I mean, there's so many different elements of having a successful network of trails in the state that need to be dealt with. So again, I want to thank you all for your time today. I know that there's a lot on your agenda and you guys are going to be having a lot of discussion, but I look forward to hearing the outcome of today. Please know that I am your biggest champion in state government. Whatever I can do to help you, I will. So please, I encourage each and every one of you to follow up with me after this, to let me know, come to us with a plan, come to us and say, this is how we need assistance, this is what we want to do. And we'll do everything we can to try to help you. So again, thank you all. Thanks for having me. Best of luck. This is a really exciting day for West Virginia to see this coming back to life.
Thank you, Secretary Ruby. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for your enthusiasm and your support for trails and outdoor recreation in West Virginia. When Secretary Ruby says she's our greatest advocate, I totally believe her. She has been a super responsive partner throughout my work in West Virginia on trails in recent years. And she's a great advocate for the entire outdoor recreation industry. So thank you for your words, Secretary. And as the Secretary said, reach out to her, bring a plan to her, and see how tourism can help implement that plan. I've been kicking around this trail community for many, many years. I am currently a part-time consultant with the Rails to Trails Conservancy. But in my past life, I was one of the founders of the North Bend Rail Trail and the founding executive director of the West Virginia Community Development Hub, which is all about building communities in West Virginia and helping them become stronger and more sustainable. A big part of that work has to do with leveraging our outdoor recreation assets. And trails are certainly one of those things that tie those assets together. With me is Nathan Hilbert. Nathan is with National Park Service. I'll let him introduce himself and talk about what he's doing. But Nathan has been a tremendous partner in creating this new organization we're going to tell you about and in helping to make this conference a reality. So Nathan.
Thanks, Ken. Hi, I'm Nathan Hilbert. I'm with the National Park Service Community Assistance, Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. And Ken's right, the assets are there, and it's time to capitalize on trails. So my job is to help out community groups like West Virginia Trail, the new organization, to get started and kind of guide them along. But I'm happy to be here. And Ken, well, it's been a good year since we've been meeting, right? It's been a while. And so last year, a group of folks got together and we said, we have some common challenges around trails and some common opportunities. And we didn't really know who was talking to whom and how we could move forward as a group. But throughout the past year, we've really worked together to build a common theme around what we're focused on here. And I found my big lesson learned here is if you want to coalesce a group, hold a conference, put a conference together, because that will make every decision, that you need to make, that will come to fruition very quickly. So it's been a pleasure to work with Ken here. Ken stayed quiet for about a month on some of those meetings, but then he started really piping up, and he was really the vision for some of these opportunities that we're capitalizing on.
Yeah, so people say that when it comes to ideas, I'm full of it. So, I want to make sure that everybody knows what West Virginia Trail stands for. If you've probably seen it on the website when you were registering, but this organization is the West Virginia Trails and Recreation Advocacy and Information Link. And we really are focused on supporting trails of all kinds in West Virginia, particularly non-motorized trails who really haven't had the advocacy and support that they need at the statewide level. Many of you who are participating in this conference are members of your local trail group, are members of perhaps a trail that you volunteer with, perhaps you're just a trail user, perhaps you're just someone who loves the outside. But we need to bring all of those people who have an interest in trails together on a regular basis so that we can advance the interests of trails as effectively as possible. So when we're talking about trails, we're talking about rail trails, obviously something close to my heart, but also mountain bike trails, park trails, water trails, equestrian trails, primitive trails, hiking trails, shared use trails, and including in fact, safe routes to schools. So bike lanes on public roadways are also part of our consideration in terms of what kinds of trails we're talking about.
Backing up a little bit, just looking at the trail system overall and the outdoor recreation economy, as Amanda talked about and Secretary Ruby was alluding to. I think, so when I talk about trails, I draw a big circle first around outdoor recreation and the outdoor recreation ecosystem. So in this big circle, we have amenities, we have outfitters, we have gear manufacturers, and of course we have trails. And trails are really the connector between all these things. So when you talk about climbers or whitewater rafters accessing their access spots or their climbing spots, it's trails that get them there. And when we talk about trails, I mean, they're simply just paths along dirt or water. They're nothing too complicated. But once we add things like economic development and tourism and education alongside those, that's when things get really interesting. And it's those benefits that we're trying to realize here. And so when trail advocates talk about trails and we want more trails, we want better trails, bigger trail systems or connected trail systems, it's really saying we want more economic development, we want more public health benefits, we want more connection to our culture and history.
And more attractive and inviting communities. Certainly trails in some ways, in some communities actually have become the new main street. Our main streets have sort of are not what they were in terms of the traffic that they see. But when I go out on the trail near my home, I often see the same people every day. We stop, we talk, we exchange news, we talk about the weather. So they become to some degree a real community connector within the community, as well as a community connector between communities. This new organization, West Virginia Trail, is not coming out of nowhere. We are working closely with what remains of the West Virginia Connecting Communities organization, which for many years ran an annual bike summit. Some of you may have attended that summit at some point in the past. We're working closely with them to sort of fill the void that they left as they sort of started to wind down, but they still maintain their 501c3 shell and maintain their 990s. So they are actually an organization, although they have not been real active. So we are going to work with them to broaden their board and convert that organization, West Virginia Connecting Communities, to West Virginia Trail. Many of the focus of West Virginia Connecting Communities is the same as what West Virginia Trail is seeking to do. First, we want to build a broad network of trail advocates, trail users, trail managers, and community and economic developers who see the potential that trails bring to community and economic development. So we want to build that broad network. Second, we want to use that network to motivate our West Virginia legislature to take a look at policies that can help trails across West Virginia. And one of the ways we're going to connect that network with the legislature is through the creation of a legislative trails caucus in the West Virginia legislature. That work has begun. Jeremy Morris is working with us to reach out to legislators and start to enlist their support for this caucus. And second, after we get that caucus built, we hope that we can look forward to support from the legislature, from the Department of Tourism, from the Department of Highways, perhaps from the Benedum Foundation, to create a new statewide trail plan. The statewide trail plan, the first one that was ever created in the state of West Virginia, was created about 20 years ago. It's time to update that and develop new implementation steps for that plan to make sure that our trails in West Virginia, trails of all kinds, have the impact that we hope that they will. So those are the big pieces of work that West Virginia Trails will be focused on. We are not here to try to help you build your local trail, although we will certainly share information on best practices. We are not here to try to steal your trail's brand. We are not here to be some sort of trail overlord. We are simply here to provide support for our local trail groups, trail users, trail advocates, trail managers, to make sure that they get the resources they need to help their trail be as successful as possible. So
that's absolutely, yeah, absolutely right. And Kent makes it seem so easy, just laying it out there, and everything's going to connect. There's 1,000 decisions that go behind all these things. So just hold a virtual conference, no big deal. That will be easy, right? And here we are after many hours of meetings and discussing about Kuva and Zoom and everything else. But yes, the vision is there, and I do want to say that we are building the plane as we're flying here. So we don't have all these details worked out, but a few people have reached out just in advertising this conference, and we hope to get back to you. And there are opportunities to get you to sign up on the proper email list on whatever track you want to take to help out with the organization here.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. That's right. The real purpose of this conference is first to get people together, as Nathan said earlier. There's no better way to mobilize people than through a conference. And even though a virtual conference is not quite the same as a face-to-face conference, this is what we have to work with right now. The goal here also is to get people familiar with West Virginia Trail and to get you connected to West Virginia Trail. So as Nathan said, we hope that folks in this conference will reach out to us as an organization and us as individuals, both panelists and presenters, and make the connections with us so that we can get you into our network, into our database, and we can help mobilize people across the state around policy issues that affect trails. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nathan at this point so that he can sort of walk through what we're going to be doing at this conference, what the format is for the coming 3 days, what you can look forward to as an attendee of this conference.
Thanks, Kent. So we have 3 days here. They're in the morning. We hopefully you can get your work done in the afternoon here. But all sessions are recorded and they'll be available for 3 months after this date. So there is opportunity to go back and look at previous sessions. We'll also post this on our website at some point, so it will be publicly accessible to everybody. But the overall format here is day one is really the vision and outlining the broader outdoor recreation and trail systems. And day two is more about planning and how we can collaboratively plan and intentionally plan different types of trail systems, considering all user types. And then day three is really about building that support, the how, when, and why to engage your local elected officials at the local, state, and federal elected officials. So there's 3 different types of sessions here. You're in the plenary session, which we're going to do today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Excuse me. And then there's the workshop sessions, which there's going to be 2 today and then 2 tomorrow. And then there's the networking sessions today and tomorrow as well. The networking sessions are really just to have a conversation around a specific user type or in a specific geography. There's nothing too complicated about it. Just show up and you'll be able to use your mic and your camera at that time to share what you're doing in this specific areas. So overall with the interaction, Whova is a complicated beast that we haven't all nailed down yet, but there's a steep learning curve. But I see a few people have already used the community forums, which is going to be really helpful. We have the chat feature and the Q&A feature on Zoom. We have the chat and polls and Q&A over on Whova. So there's plenty of opportunities to put your questions and your chats and everything else. But I would really encourage you to go into the Whova platform, click around, check out some of the questions, and see what everything is about there. A few other things. Also check out our sponsors in the Whova app. They have each have their own profiles and links to their own websites, and you'll learn quite a bit about what everyone's up to there. And I believe that's about it. Yeah. So I'm going to pass it back over to Kent here. Kent, you're muted.
One thing I want to hit on is the fact that this is the first of statewide trail conference of its type here in West Virginia. We've had statewide conferences around trails before. This is the most inclusive and the broadest conference and the first of its type in the state, but it's not going to be the last. We will be looking forward to hosting another conference in the fall of 2022. And in order to have the best possible conference, we're going to learn what we can from this one, see what works and what doesn't work. So we want to hear from all of you about what you thought about the sessions and about the conference overall, and to hear your suggestions and recommendations for what we do in 2022. And hopefully a few of you will step up and say, I'm willing to help with that next statewide trail conference in 2022. I want to move on to our keynote speaker this morning, but before I do that, I want to make sure that we recognize the generosity, first of all, of the sponsors that have been mentioned and that Nathan mentioned can be seen on the Whova site. Their generosity is really important. And it's not just their money, it's their engagement with this work that's important. So I want to thank all of the sponsors, but I especially want to thank the Benedum Foundation, the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. They really are the ones that made this conference possible. They provided the biggest chunk of funding for this conference and a lot of thought support as well. Benedum has been a really strong supporter of our outdoor recreation industry and of the community development and community-based economic development that results from the outdoor recreation industry. And trails are certainly at the heart of it. My first encounter with the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation was when we were creating the North Bend Rail Trail, and the Benedum Foundation was the initial funder for some of the development of the North Bend Rail Trail. They started the ball rolling for us, and they really were an important factor in making that trail a reality. And that was almost 30 years ago. So we're looking at a lot of support over many decades from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. And I want to thank them strongly for that support. They're so critical to much of the good things that are happening in West Virginia. They are our state's largest and most important philanthropic organization. All right, time to move on to Peter Harnick. Peter is a longtime environmental activist and writer, and most important to me and to this conference right now is the fact that Peter Harnick was the co-founder of the Rails to Trails Conservancy. He served for over 10 years as the Rails to Trails Conservancy Vice President for Programs. He has spoken and traveled broadly, studying all the factors that have led to successful local and state trails programs around the country. He has analyzed what made parks successful for the Trust for Public Land. And this year, he published From Rails to Trails through the University of Nebraska Press, the first comprehensive history of the national movement for rail trails. I have a copy of the book, Peter. I haven't finished it yet, but it's really engaging. It's fascinating. As someone who is sort of starting into rail trails at the beginning, it's just a fascinating read. Peter lives in Arlington, Virginia, travels to West Virginia pretty regularly, loves West Virginia's trails. And he has served as the president and longtime board member of the Washington Area Bicycle Association and is a graduate of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Peter, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for speaking today. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kent. Wonderful seeing you. I was trying to remember, I think we go back to maybe 1988 or 89. So we've really been through the wars together. And it's wonderful to see you continuing the leadership and the effort in your state, and all the new people that I'm meeting, Nathan, Amanda, Lisa, and the nice remarks from Chelsea Ruby. That was very interesting. So let me see if I can, I'm more worried about the technology than I am about the speech. So Kelly is helping me, Kelly Peck. I'm trying to.
You're doing well, Peter.
Okay,
I think if you go to presentation mode.
Here we go. All right.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go.
Perfect. Looks
Thank
good.
you, Kelly. You're the key cog in all this, both politically and technologically. Okay, almost heaven. You've already heard that a few times, and that's the theme, definitely, almost heaven. I'm one of the 44 million people who live in the 5 states surrounding the 1.8 million people, million of you who live in West Virginia. It's kind of a mind-boggling thing to think about, but you're surrounded by such a large population base of people who are looking for beautiful places and great things to do. So just in Maryland, where I live, Washington, D.C., there's 44 million of us, and many of you think in those terms of almost heaven. In preparation for this conference, like Kent said, I even went to West Virginia with friends this past weekend, just a couple days ago, to hike one of your trails, the trails up Tibbetts Knob. Some of you might know it, right near Wolf Gap on the Virginia border. Beautiful hike. And struggling up the cliffs near the top, and then suddenly emerging onto the spectacle of the sun and breeze over thousands of candy-colored trees below, I had that same thought, almost heaven. What a difference from one of those. I went to Wikipedia to do a little reading about West Virginia, and I came across the fact that one of the state's old slogans was they called it the COG state. Hopefully none of you have heard that. COG, that stands for coal, oil, and gas. So almost heaven is a much better way of thinking about the state than the COG state. Everything flows downhill out of the mountain state: wood, water, coal, wealth, and even people. Only 5 states have more poverty than West Virginia, and only 5 states have less per capita wealth. And West Virginia has lost more population than any other state. So those are some pretty grim realities that you all know. But I think a trails and a trail-based economy, or at least a trail-oriented economy, has the potential to reverse that downhill gravity that has stimulated all that outflow. Heaven is not downhill, heaven is up. Downhill is the easy way. Heaven requires some effort, a revision of thinking. My book devotes its early pages to the power and glory of railroading, to the phenomenal growth of the system, and to the overwhelming social and economic impact that the industry had on the United States, beginning all the way back in 1830. I didn't start with the trails, I started with the railroads. The railroads made America, but they were also a major factor in the downhill flow of resources out of West Virginia. They took out the lumber, they took out the coal, and they took out the profits to Baltimore and Norfolk and Cleveland and Philadelphia and New York and Boston. Now, after so much social upheaval and environmental damage, it would be true poetic justice if the one resource that remains, the abandoned corridors, can serve as the basis for a new economy for the state. Nearly half of the state's original railroad network has been abandoned. Of the 3,000, as you see here, 3,974 miles at the height of the system back in 1916, only 2,228 were still functioning in 2010. That's the most recent number I had, and I'm sure it's a little bit lower than that by now. So that's at least 1,746 miles of abandonments, of which you guys at this conference, on this Zoom, have already saved 598 miles as trails, which is wonderful. So the great news is that of all the states, West Virginia is 13th best in the country as the ratio of trail mileage to abandoned rail mileage. In other words, 32%, as you can see here, 32.4% of all the state's abandoned corridors have thus far become trails. On that metric, you're actually doing the Pennsylvania, which is considered the heavyweight of the rail to trail movement on the basis of trails created out of abandonments. I know that this is a broad-ranging conference that goes beyond rail trails, but I'll be talking about other kinds of trails too. But I want to begin by putting forward to you where I personally am coming from. Whoops. Let me go back to this blank slide for a minute. And I'm going to read you a paragraph from the book, just to get a personal view here. If you're cycling on a trail and it's getting dark, and you're on the verge of being late enough to get a reprimand when you come home, but the rhythm of your legs and the cadence of your lungs are so perfect, and the glimpse of the view around the next broad bend is so enticing, and you haven't had to shift gears for what feels like forever, or make more than the barest tweak to the angle of your handlebar, and the bridges fly over the passing streams with implacable authority, and you simply can't bring yourself to turn around or stop, then it's a rail trail. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book, because of my love of that sensation. And the other reason is that many people come up to me and say, I love trails. I wish there were more of them. Why don't you put in more trails? And I'll say to them, well, show me an abandoned railroad track and maybe we can create another one. And they'll say, this was once a railroad? I never knew that. Fortunately, West Virginia is already way ahead of the curve when it comes to rail trails. So as I said, 598 miles, you've got 69 trails already, unless RTC has come up with a new number since I checked their webpage. There's 15 current projects. I'm sure some of you are on the call right now trying to create your project with 122 more miles. And West Virginia ranks 14 of all the states. West Virginia is 14th in the number of trails and 12th in the mileage. So that's pretty great for a smaller state that has challenges with wealth and environmental issues. And some of you real old timers might remember that RTC and some of you worked together on an abandoned rail corridor assessment back in 1994 that we published. And it's really exciting, but of all the corridors identified in that Rails to Trails study, half of them have already become trails. And here's a little overview of the rail trails in the state. And of course, when Kent's idea of creating a new Rails to Trail, a new trail plan for the state comes into being, hopefully we can identify more of these trails and convert more of them. In my book, I draw many kinds of distinctions to help people understand how trails come about, not so much physically, but politically. One of the most important distinctions is between urban trails and rural trails. In urban areas, trails are strongly advocated by bicyclists and promoted as an alternative to the automobile and as a partial solution to the traffic problems. In rural areas, traffic problems do not rule the way they do in urban areas, but trails are strongly advocated by tourism officials and promoted as a partial solution to economic development problems. In both cases, bicyclists, as well as walkers and runners and other out of the mainstream users, are key participants. But in urban areas, the effort is to make room for them, and in rural areas, it is to make them feel wanted. In urban areas, bicyclists are demanding a seat at the table, while in rural areas, local leaders are demanding that cyclists from other places find out about them and then come and enjoy what's being offered. It's quite a different mentality. And in my book, the two examples I use to highlight this dichotomy are the Capitol Crescent Trail in Washington, D.C., and the Virginia Creeper Trail in the towns of Abingdon and Damascus, Virginia, not too far from West Virginia. I'm not going to talk about the Capitol Crescent. Both of them had tumultuous political histories and very difficult creation stories, and I won't be talking about the Crescent, but I will be talking about the Virginia Creeper, because that's much more in keeping with the situation in West Virginia and probably the situation that most of you are facing in your communities. So I'll read you a little bit from the book. When the Norfolk and Western Railroad petitioned for the abandonment of its Virginia Creeper line in Virginia and North Carolina, the response in the small town of Abingdon and the hamlets of Damascus and White Top was not excitement, but fear. Fear that it meant another economic catastrophe following the recent shutdown of the area's lumber mills. The public's first reaction was a wall of opposition that delayed the abandonment for 5 years. Initially, the locals wanted to maintain freight and passenger service. When that dream proved hopeless, they shifted their desire to a tourist railroad. But for such a little visited area, that too was unrealistic. Meanwhile, Norfolk and Western was impatient to salvage its tracks and its ties and the 100 bridges and trestles along the 132-mile route. Just at that moment, David Brillhard, let me put this on a blank screen here. Just at that moment, David Brillhard, a county planning commissioner, read about an abandoned track somewhere out in Iowa or Wisconsin, he couldn't really remember, that had been turned into a trail. Fellow Commissioner French Moore pricked up his ears when he heard that, as did a couple of creative staffers at the National Forest, the Jefferson National Forest nearby, which already contained a piece of the Appalachian Trail. But the rail trail concept was a new idea in a place that preferred old ideas, and the opposition was widespread. Of the opponents, half of them wanted the land for themselves, while the rest were just fearful of undesirables walking or off-roading through backyard fields and woods. So the adjacent farmers agitated for more time to try and raise money to buy their individual segments. On the other side of the issue, French, French Moore, who was by that time mayor of Abingdon, led trail advocates in their search for money and for political support. He was particularly aware of the importance of the major trestles in that mountainous region. If the trestles weren't saved, the corridor would be almost useless. He assembled 5 or 6 people, including Rick Boucher, the local state senator, on a legal committee to deal with the railroad and to handle a lawsuit by one of the adjacent farm families. He then convinced the Tennessee Valley Authority to pay for the purchase of materials for bridge decking and guardrails, and he prevailed upon the local Job Corps Center to provide free labor. This was trail building in the tradition of barn raising. His wife, Marianne, remembered, in the beginning, it wasn't easy. The hearings were vicious. I came home in tears after some of them. French, who was also a dentist, lost some of his patience over his advocacy for the trail. Now that it's open, the Virginia Creeper is one of the most remarkable rail trails in the country. With its remote backwoods location, it should get almost no usership at all, yet it is so bustling that it has signs warning, keep to the right, pull off the trail if you're stopped, and ride with caution. And the trail gets over 250,000 miles a year and has even spurred some of these economic development adjuncts like this van shuttle that pulls people to the top if they don't want to ride all the way up before they ride down. And here's their latest new conversion of their station to a shop. Sadly, we don't yet have a Virginia Creeper story in West Virginia. Despite your state's many successes, no trail yet seems to have the kind of usership that would make a significant economic impact. And I'm using the word seems because there's a shortage of usership data, not only in West Virginia, but across the whole nation. And I'm going to come back to this. One great thing about West Virginia that really sets it apart from almost every other state in the country is the fact that it has 2 very different kinds of trail systems that intersect with each other. Steep, rugged, high mountain trails and flat, smooth, down in the valley trails. There's remarkably few places in the country that have this double-barreled attraction. For instance, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Iowa all have tremendous numbers of rail trails, hundreds of rail trails, but they have precious few places for vertical climbs and great views. And on the other side, Colorado and Idaho and Wyoming have fabulous peaks, but they have relatively fewer railroad corridors of any type, abandoned or not abandoned. West Virginia has them both, potentially allowing for a family of, say, 6 people to come out here with 3 bicycles and 3 pairs of hiking boots, with plans to rendezvous at a restaurant at the end of the day for story comparing. And I haven't even thrown in river rafting. As a matter of fact, in my book, I described how the high mountain Appalachian Trail influenced the formation of the Rails to Trails movement. The very early Rails to Trails advocates were people who included May Thalgard Watts on the left in Chicago and Waldo Nielsen on the right in Rochester, New York. Neither of them were bicyclists. They were walkers and hikers. But notice the almost polar difference between these two systems of rail trails and the Appalachian Trail. And I'll read you one other paragraph from my book. This goes back to the beginning of the Appalachian Trail. The proposed Appalachian Trail was not a rail trail. In fact, the Appalachian Trail is decidedly the antithesis of a rail trail. Benton McKay's concept traversed the high country. It was rugged, it was remote, it meandered, and it depended upon the goodwill and the handshake agreements of a continuous string of landowners. That's how the AT was created. Rail corridors, in contrast, wend their way through the valleys. They're essentially flat. They run from town to town. They run through the thick of commerce, and they're locked into a very specific route by bands of steel. Still, both of them can grab their users' imaginations, stimulating them to wonder what's around every next bend, and also to dream of life in the past. Either the far distant past of the Native Americans walking through the tops of our mountains, or the less distant past of railroads creating the small towns throughout the state and the nation. Oops, so there's the AT, you all know that. Now let's dig into tourism a little bit. I loved hearing some of the things that that Secretary Ruby said, very exciting and important, and I want to dig in a little bit on tourism myself. For nature-based tourism to work, you need two ingredients: great nature and a great human experience. West Virginia has nature in spades, but it might sometimes fall short on the other dimension. For example, in comparison to more sophisticated mountain destinations like Switzerland or even Vermont. To me, the human part of the experience means some romantic charm, good food, memorable lodging, thoughtful signage, attractive amenities, historic preservation, as Nathan was referring to, and friendly and attentive service. All the things that make visitors say, that was a great vacation. I'm going to tell my friends and let's plan on doing it again. Vermont, for instance, has environmental protection laws that require returnable bottles and reduce roadside litter, and they ban billboards. And the state has a very intertwined tourism promotion industry that seeks to jointly uplift all the restaurants, hotels, country inns, bed and breakfasts. I don't think Vermont is inherently any more beautiful than West Virginia, but the state seems to work harder at promoting its charms and eliminating some of the flaws that might discourage tourists. And by the way, Vermont doesn't hold a candle to West Virginia on the Rails to Trails score. It only has 19 rail trails and a total of 148 miles. So they're Johnny-come-lately compared to you guys. A place that I personally consider maybe the pinnacle location for trail-based tourism is Acadia National Park in Maine. And you don't need to be a national park to make this work. In some respects, the fact that it's a national park actually has some challenges for Acadia. So it's not the fact that it's a national park. And Acadia doesn't have any rail trails at all, but it does have a system of carefully designed carriage roads that have many similar characteristics to rail trails. They're car-free, wide, relatively gentle, and surfaced with crushed gravel. Nearby are outstanding bike shops for rentals and repairs, along with numerous restaurants and places of lodging. The maps and the signage are outstanding. And by now they even have a free bus transit system that includes bike racks. And intersecting this network of gentle trails are beautifully laid out and designed steep mountain trails that for the strong, physically intrepid hikers who want a high level view. So just like you could do here in West Virginia. I'm running out of time, but I know that you want me to say a few words about trail funding. Funding is obviously on many people's minds, and I'm sure it will be the dominant issue for much of the conference. And Kent really spelled out the way that funding is going to, be approached by building political will. I don't know enough about the specifics of each of your trails and your trail projects to speak in specifics about them. So I'm going to resort to a generality that I go into some detail in my book. If you have a great project, the money will flow to it. It doesn't mean your life is easy, just sit back and wait for the money to flow, because you need to have a great project. And by a great project, I mean one that has 3 components: a governmental agency that agrees to own the trail, an advocacy organization that tirelessly works the politics to make the trail happen, and a written plan describing what the trail will be like and what benefits it will bring. This is what we learned the hard way through Rails to Trails Conservancy over the years. And it ties in very perfectly with what Kent has outlined for a statewide effort, a sort of a Rails to Trails triangle on a statewide basis. All the individual trails working to make it happen on the statewide basis. If you don't have the 3 legs of the Rails to Trails triangle, there's a very good chance you're going to fail. We've seen this. We've seen projects with 2 very strong legs and missing the 3rd leg and not making it. And if you do have the 3 legs, you have a much better chance at victory. And what I don't say in the book, but we'll say now at the conference, is that this identical 3-legged structure could work on the statewide level. This is very inspirational to me to hear about what you're doing. So in closing, I want to focus on 3 takeaways that I hope can come out of the conference, along with the main ones that Kent laid forth for all of you. One is a commitment to data acquisition and compilation. We don't have enough data to make our case, and we need to count everything. Mostly, we need to count users. It's not that easy to do, but you need to do the best job you can to count the people that are actually using your trail and using the facilities surrounding the trail. That's the message that will resonate with the politicians, with the newspaper editors, and everybody else in between. Takeaway number 2, I would strongly urge a fact-finding trip. Maybe to the Virginia Creeper, that's relatively easy to get to, maybe to Vermont, maybe to Switzerland if the Benedum Foundation will really pony up. But at least to Vermont or some other states that do a very good job with their tourism economy. You don't want to necessarily look at their trails. You want to look at how they market their trails. Everything from the state maps that they put out that highlight the trails and everything else, how you can do similar things or better things here in West Virginia. And then takeaway number 3, like I was saying, how to build the statewide Rails to Trails triangle in West Virginia to support and build up each of your local trail efforts around the state and get more funding for what you're doing. So that's it. Happy trails. And I think possibly we might have time for a little bit of a conversation. And if not, have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to ask Kent and Nathan to turn on their cameras and we'll get you in gallery view together.
All right. Peter, thank you so much. We really appreciate those comments. They really reflect the direction I think that we're going in West Virginia and highlights the potential that we have here for making trails a real driver of our community improvement and our economic development. So thanks a lot for that. We have time for questions, and if people want to send those questions in through the Q&A the option, we'll try to forward those to Peter. In the meantime, I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions that came to mind for me. Peter, what is the role of beer in trail development?
Of beer.
Beer.
Well, I don't know. I've never been asked that before. Has that been important in your trail creation?
Oh, I think it's important with cyclists everywhere. But I think the point of the question really is that there's this dynamic where we have trails and then we have the amenities that trail users want. And to have a great trail without access to those amenities, sometimes the amenities are as simple as restrooms, right? But certainly to have a place where at the end of their ride, they can sit with their friends and have a beer. Perhaps before the ride, they can have a cup of coffee in a coffee shop in that community before they head out. I think those are important. And you touched on that a good bit, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit about how you motivate communities to develop those businesses that are necessary for them to leverage their trails effectively.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a dichotomy here of some people feeling like they want to keep the local culture totally historic, intersect all that well with what out-of-state people are looking for, and then others who are willing to bend the culture a little bit to meet the needs of visitors. It's kind of a possibly a little bit of a wrenching discussion about how true do you want to be to your old values and what do you want to do for your new values. People who live in a high pressure, environmentally rundown work situation in the cities and think about West Virginia as almost heaven and want to get away to it, have a great mental picture of the beautiful countryside and bicycling and using the rivers and everything else. And like you were saying, Kent, they want to be able to marry that together with what they're used to in terms of having a beer, having a coffee, having a good meal, having a charming place to stay, a bed and breakfast lodge or whatever. And so the locals who are oriented in that direction and want to make that happen need to keep very much in mind what people are looking for when they want to come to West Virginia and experience that. So it does take a different kind of person to do that, I think.
Thank you. That it is a challenge. There's a double-edged sword there in terms of investing in trails and investing in the support system around trails.
Exactly.
A lot of people talk about using trails as a tourism driver, and we believe that to be true. But I think I'd like you to elaborate a little bit about how creating trails in a community should really be about enhancing that community for those who live there, and how it can really create an environment where more people will want to live in that community because it has an accessible trail system.
So maybe the question is, you're talking about French and the Creeper Trail. What would have made French's life a little easier in his advocacy at the local level?
That's definitely true. What would have made it easier? I mean, for all of us that are trail advocates, this is like turning around the oil tanker, the million-ton oil tanker that is sort of the American way of doing things, turning it around. We're the little people that are trying to throw ourselves against this huge factor of the way people have been living, and so French needed an advocacy organization. He pretty much had to create it himself. Many of you have needed advocacy organizations. Some of you have created it yourself in your community. Some of you were fortunate enough that earlier people created it, and now you need to utilize it or build it up or rejuvenate it. But the advocacy is the key thing. It's the key thing that made Rails to Trails Conservancy successful, to just tell the advocates, show the advocates that they're not alone, show the advocates that it's been done before, and there's many people that agree with them, even if some of them are a little bit reluctant to speak up, to be the first person to speak up. If you speak up, you'll have people following in your footsteps. And like I said, you need these other things. You need a government agency that will support your, because it's too heavy of a lift for just the advocates. But the advocacy group is the key.
Yeah, and that applies at the local level as well as at the statewide level, which is what we're trying to do here with West Virginia Trail, is develop that statewide voice. I think a lot of it has to do with the ability for people not to feel that they're not the ones that are out there by themselves advocating for trails, but rather that there is a whole community across the state or even within their community that supports this trail work. I know that rural West Virginians are conservative by nature, and they look for answers sometimes by looking at what has worked in the past. And sometimes when you're bringing new ideas, like the idea of a new trail into a community, there's some hesitancy because they don't know that that's going to work. So perhaps it's a matter of making sure that there's a network of people within that community who are willing to stand together and share that message that, yeah, we know this can work because we've seen it work other places.
Exactly.
Nathan, did you have any questions to throw out there?
Yeah, I was curious, how can some of these approaches, like the three-leg system or the triangle that you referred to, be applied to other types of trail systems? Is there any difference? Is it kind of the same in terms of advocacy and seeking permission for different land authorities, that type of thing? Or do you kind of see a little different for folks who are trying to build trails in places like the National Forest or the National Park Service lands, or West Virginia DNR lands?
Well, I mean, in the National Forest, you already have, theoretically, you already have the government agency that owns it. Now they may, if they're not willing to, if they're not interested in trails, in a trail there, that may be a different kind of problem, because they already own the land. And in my book, I have a story about a trail in California, a very interesting trail, the Biz Johnson Trail, that runs. It was a railroad, and after the railroad was abandoned, part of the land was owned by the railroad. Part of the land went through U.S. Forest Service land, and part of the land went through Bureau of Land Management land. And so there were three different possible owners or institutions to deal with. Of course, the railroad wanted to get rid of it, and it was important to move it on from the railroad to something else. But when most of the land was actually in the National Forest, but it turned out that the person who was most motivated to create a trail happened to work for the Bureau of Land Management. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And finally, the Forest Service said, look, you're so enthusiastic about this, and you have such good ideas about how to make it happen. We'll just give the whole thing to you. And you, even though it's mostly in our land, we'll just let you put the whole thing together. So it probably wouldn't have happened without him, even though it was already in public ownership. So when you're dealing with the entity that already owns it, it's probably a little bit of a different factor, but basically it's the same rails to trails triangle, or the same triangle. It's just you have to think it through a little bit differently. And then with rivers, of course, River Trail, Blue Trails, that will be a whole different conversation about who owns the river and who controls the river and things like that. So that would be, again, each one needs its own factor. But you're basically, if you cut it down to the most basic, you're dealing with human activism, physical land ownership, and then a plan so that people can understand what you're talking about, to try and assuage some of the concerns that some of these, like Kent was saying, conservative people who don't like to try new things or scared of trying new things. You want to give them a plan to say, this is what we're thinking of actually doing. This is what it's going to look like. This is how it's going to be operated. This is what our goals are. So they don't feel like you're stealing their land and have a completely different plan in mind.
That's a great segue for a question that we have from one of our attendees, Peter, and that is, what are the elements that should be included in a well-written trail plan? In your experience with rail trails, of course, it's sort of focused on rail trails, but a plan is a plan. What are the elements that plan should include as we start thinking about what we want to include in our revised, updated statewide trail plan that we hope to come out of this whole process with?
Okay, good. Well, first of all, the plan should acknowledge what study, acknowledge, and really lay down it so that everybody can see it, what currently exists, so that we know exactly what is out there now, what has been accomplished. Like I said, there have been some great accomplishments in the state already, and those should be laid out there. Then you need a process to try and figure out what people want, preferably as democratically as possible. Of course, you're going to go to the outspoken advocates first, and they'll come up with their list of things that they are working on or dreaming about. But then going as broadly as possible to the general public, making sure that everybody feels invited and welcome to give their ideas. A lot of the ideas might be a little bit out there, a little bit surprising, a little bit unrealistic, or whatever, and some of them might be brilliant that none of us have thought about. So just making sure that everybody, as many people as possible, know that this process is underway and have a method of being part of it, sending in their ideas. Like I said, getting as much data as possible about who's using the trails, who would be using the trails, who wants to be using the trails, what kinds of people they are, the difference between locals and tourists, tourists from other parts of the state and then out of state, segmenting your possible usership base and understanding the differences between those. And then coming up with an estimated budget of what it would, ranking your choices after you've come up with all your choices, ranking them, and again trying to do that in as democratic and open a process as possible so that you can rank the choices. The conversation between a new rail trail versus a striping a bike lane on a safe routes to school, that's a very important conversation to have as to which is more important, or what the order of creating those things is, who would be better served and who would be more protected from it and things like that. Then coming up with a budget that, or an estimated budget about what it would really cost, and of course it's going to cost more than we have. So how to phase it in, what should be done first and what should be done second and third, and then figuring out a timeline. And one thing that I have found with many trail plans, sometimes I've seen some beautiful trail plans or park plans that have done everything right, except they've been very coy about figuring out what the budget would be and figuring out what the timeline would be. And if you don't put in a budget and a timeline, that's a recipe for your plan to end up sitting on the shelf, because the budget, brings it to the reality of coming to either your state legislature, your governor, or your U.S. Department of Transportation, or wherever else you're going to be getting your funding from. And the timeline is what makes the thing happen. That's so many plans have been just sitting there for years and years and years. Yeah, it's in our plan, but we don't have a timeline. So if you're able to come up with a timeline and you can say, hey, this has to be done in 6 months, and then when 6 months comes and it isn't done, you say, hey, we missed our deadline. We're behind on this thing. That's the way to hold people's feet to the fire.
That's really
Peter, yeah, that's great. Peter, I have a burning question. It's, as a planner, I look at different alternatives. So when someone comes to me and they say, we want to build a trail, there's a rail abandonment here, I ask them, is this the right trail to build? Is there ever a wrong trail? And what would be a wrong trail? Something to just walk away from? Like, what would be the criteria to just walk away from an opportunity?
There's probably no global answer to that question. It might be wrong because the politics of the trail is so bad that even though it would be a great trail, it's impossible for whatever reason. Or it might be wrong because from a planning perspective, it doesn't really serve. It would be, let's say, very expensive to do, and it wouldn't really serve very many people or something like that. I don't know, there's 2,000 rail trails in the country. They vary tremendously as to their success. There's some trails out there that in retrospect probably aren't doing too many people too much good. They might have some benefits from being really beautiful for the few people that use it or whatever else. And on the flip side, there may be some trails that are pretty unattractive but are actually super useful. So there's so many different ways of splicing that. I don't think there's a global answer to that.
Goes back to that intentional planning piece for sure.
It does go back to that planning piece. And I think one of the things we're looking at in West Virginia is the potential of more railroad corridor abandonments as coal declines. And we have limited resources. So we have to pick trails to acquire and develop that will have the most positive impact possible in terms of community and economic development. And so that's really one of the top priorities of creating a statewide trail plan, is to help us figure out a strategy for identifying the corridors we want to invest in and the types of trails we want to invest in. We're running out of time here a little bit, but I wanted to highlight one more question for you, Peter. Don't know if you have any experience in this, but one question we had was, what have you observed in organizations as they went from being an all-volunteer organization to an organization that is supported by paid staff? How did they get there? And what was the impact of shifting towards paid staff? And this is a question that West Virginia Trail as an organization has to be looking at. We're all volunteers right now, but we're looking at how we can be more sustainable and effective. And paid staff is certainly one of the tools that would help. What's your experience with that?
Well, I'm very supportive of paid staff. I would say that the initial goal would be a staff of 3. That seems to be the most workable way of getting up some power for your bucks. The volunteers are always going to be super important, both as board members and as other types of volunteers. But the paid staff provides the continuity that just keeps, it's so traditional for volunteer organizations to have things fall through the cracks all the time. All of us have the best intentions. We leave a meeting feeling like we're definitely going to do what we promised we would do, and then it slips away, and it's suddenly 4 weeks later, and you haven't done it yet. So having the paid staff in some cases almost only operates as a nagging system for the board to get it to deliver on its promises. But even that is tremendously valuable. Pretty much makes all the difference. So I'm a huge fan of paid staff. You got to take it one step at a time. Get your first staff and then gradually get it up. And you want a director who is, of course, does everything fabulously, both the public outreach and working with the board. You need somebody that can tightrope on both of those lines. And then you need somebody to raise money. And then you need somebody to do the sort of the technical work. And that's where you get to your sort of 3-person staff that can lead to a really great organization, and then build from there if you can.
Great, thank you. That's a great goal to have. It might take a number of years to get there. I think West Virginia Trail would be really happy just to have a half-time person.
Yeah, and that's how you start.
Grow. Yeah. Nathan, how are we doing on time? Do we have time for one more question?
We have a short question, or a short answer. Time for a short answer. If there's one more if there's a burning one that you have.
Well, one of the questions I see is a question about how we can connect trail building to our historic and cultural assets in West Virginia. We have a lot of untold history here. And I wonder what your experience is in terms of what the impact of that is and how successful communities have done that.
Yeah, and I'm a huge advocate of that. I think the historical connections, both with railroads and other technology, and going earlier than that, is tremendously important. Well, again, I don't know how strong the historic preservation movement is in the state in terms of actual organizations and volunteers that are interested in it. But bringing them on as part of the coalition would be tremendously important. And the other trail that's closer by than going up to Vermont that has a lot of lessons for all of you, I think, is the Great Allegheny Passage, primarily in Pennsylvania, a little bit in Maryland. And they had a very similar situation of most of the people being clueless and uninterested in their history. And as that trail has brought more and more people into that part of the country, there's been a tremendous upsurge in interest in the technological and natural historical values of that region. So you can do the exact same thing or more.
Peter, you're going to steal Augie Carlino's thunder. He's speaking on Thursday.
Okay. No, I'm sure he has a lot of thunder.
Good messages can't be heard enough, right?
That's right.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of this. I particularly appreciate your advocacy for the Benedum Foundation to fund a trip to Switzerland for all of us. So I think that was a great idea, brilliant idea. We'll be reaching out to Mary Hunt at Benedum and seeing where that goes, right?
Okay.
So thank you. I think we're going to turn it over to Nathan now to talk about where we go next. Is that right?
That's right. I am the housekeeper here. So next session, we have 2 concurrent workshops. We have one about West Virginia trails maintenance, some opportunities and challenges around trail maintenance in West Virginia. And we have a panel for trail successes. We have 3 panelists that are going to talk about their unique successes around their specific trail types. I do have a little more housekeeping of, I'm told to use Zoom and not Whova as an attendee. And when you go to a session, you should have 2 options. It should be Whova on the left and Zoom on the left and Whova on the right. And click on the Zoom to make sure you have a stable connection. And then we have user groups this afternoon at 12 o'clock. That's including the mountain biking, water trails, hiking and backpacking, the equestrian use, and kind of a rail trail biking group. And this is just any type of affinity that you have toward any of these groups. All these sessions, again, will be recorded. So if you miss anything on the concurrent sessions, or if you want to go to 2 different sessions, there will be an opportunity to view it later. Other than that, we will see you at 10:30 in one of the 2 sessions. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody.